I have long chastised the parents of my freshman world history students for allowing their children to dress up on Halloween as Cleopatra. Doing so has amused me for 20 years as my students get a chance to snicker at their classmates after I briefly explain how Cleopatra, having been smuggled into Caesar's bedchambers hidden within a rolled-up rug, quote-unquote convinced the Roman consul to support her rule. We'll delve deeper into that infamous scene and its historical accuracy in depth in the second episode of this series. But for now, know that it's an incredibly important moment in world history, as Cleopatra claimed that amidst all of that convincing, she conceived a male son 9 months later. Time constraints and limited understanding of the content has reduced Cleopatra to a one-dimensional character who only survived by seducing the powerful men of her time. Nothing could be further from the truth, as Cleopatra, regardless of her gender, remains one of the most effective rulers in history. The Smithsonian magazine describes her as a capable, clear-eyed sovereign. She knew how to build a fleet, suppress an insurrection, control a currency. One of Mark Antony's most trusted generals vouched for her political acumen. Even at a time when female rulers were no rarity, Cleopatra stood out, the sole woman of her world to rule alone. Despite this, we continue to deny the Egyptian queen her rightful place as a feminist icon. While men like Oppenheimer and Napoleon recently received their Hollywood immortalization, Cleopatra last graced our big screens in 1963, when she was played by Elizabeth Taylor, the in-actress of the moment. The movie was an epic disaster, almost single-handedly destroying the 20th Century Fox studios. On the red carpet of its premiere, the movie's director responded to a reporter's upbeat excitement for the movie with the comment, "You must know something that I don't. I feel as though the guillotine is about to drop." Taylor, whose real-life affair with her co-star came to light, described the 2-year process of bringing Cleopatra to theaters by saying, "It was probably the most chaotic time of my life. That hasn't changed," says Taylor, who has seldom discussed the Cleopatra experience publicly. What with the scandal, the Vatican banning me, people making threats on my life, falling madly in love, it was fun and it was dark. Oceans of tears, but some good times too. In 1963, no one would have thought twice about casting a white British actor to play an Egyptian queen. Only 7 years earlier, Howard Hughes financed The Conqueror, a big-budget blockbuster about Genghis Khan. The DVD sleeve boasts that the hit movie about the Asian Mongols includes an all-star international cast, which features Susan Hayward, Angus Moorhead, Pedro Armendariz, as well as John Wayne as Genghis Khan. If you're keeping track, the closest that Hughes got to an Asian in the top line of that cast was a Mexican named Pedro. Reader's Digest notes that of course nowadays the casting of and dressing up as the Elizabeth Taylor version of Cleopatra comes across as blatant whitewashing. In 2020, Gal Gadot announced that she was teaming up with Patty Jenkins, the director of Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman franchise, to bring Cleopatra back to the big screen in a massive Hollywood blockbuster. Immediately, cancel culture raised its ugly head to point out the obvious fact that Gadot was white. The ensuing outrage, however, merely served to show how little modern-day society understands about Cleopatra. Gadot addressed the controversy, pointing out that, first of all, if you want to be true to the facts, then Cleopatra was Macedonian. We were looking for a Macedonian actress that could fit Cleopatra. She wasn't there. and I was very passionate about Cleopatra. While some could take issue with the fact that Godot is Israeli and that Egypt and Israel have at times in history waged war against each other, the fact that internet trolls attempted to destroy Gal Gadot, a white woman, for attempting to play a white woman shows how little we know about one of the greatest women of all time. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon the rise and fall of Egyptian ruler Cleopatra. Episode number 1, The Rise of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, an offshoot of the conquests of Alexander the Great. Alexander's father Philip had gained insight while growing up as a political hostage in Thebes. He managed to ascend to the leader of Macedonia, which at the time was a subservient province of a Greek polis. Utilizing his earned knowledge, he lengthened the size of his soldiers' weapons, enhancing the already formidable Greek phalanx, the fighting formation that had allowed the Peloponnesians to twice repulse the significantly larger Persian Empire. Taking advantage of his newfound military edge and the decades of ongoing civil war on the Greek mainland, he carved out a small kingdom of connected city-states known as the Corinthian League. Trouble arose, however, when Philip decided to marry a third wife, a Macedonian named Cleopatra. This wasn't the Cleopatra, of course, as the queen's appearance was still centuries away. Philip's decision to marry again angered the Greek mother of his only male child, Alexander. At the wedding, a drunken reveler toasted the nuptials between the leader and his new Macedonian-born wife by proclaiming that after a successful honeymoon, Macedonia would finally have a pure-blooded heir. In a fit of rage, Alexander stormed off. Having already conquered his first city by the age of 16, he wasn't a figure to be messed with. Philip attempted to smooth things over with his son, bringing him in during a wedding festival for his daughter, with the intent to make it clear to all that the half-Greek Alexander would remain his favored heir, even if his new marriage managed to produce a son. Unfortunately, this olive branch to his son only fueled rage amongst the nobility. Macedonians are intensely proud of their heritage. In 2009, the Christian Science Monitor published an article titled 2,300 Years Later, Alexander Mania Grips Macedonia. In it, it is revealed that Greece expressed its preference for the former province of Yugoslavia to drop the name Macedonia in favor of something new, claiming that because Macedonia had once been a province of Greece, it held ownership over their identity. At stake was Macedonia's admission to the European Union, something that in 2009 was intensely sought after for the nation's economic well-being, as well as having major implications for a country's national security. The Monitor, however, points out that the vast majority of Macedonians would have rather missed out on EU admission than make any compromise with the Greeks over its name. The fights over whether or not a full-blooded Macedonian ought to be the heir to the throne resulted in one of Philip's bodyguards fatally stabbing the ruler during the festivities of Philip's daughter, who also happened to be named Cleopatra. There are some who find that answer far too simple, making the death of King Philip into one of history's greatest whodunits. Aristotle, the private tutor to Alexander, wrote on the matter, as did a number of leading scholars of the era. Accusations were lobbed that the perpetrator had lashed out because the king hadn't defended his guard after an allegation had been lodged that the man was a hermaphrodite. Others asserted that the plot was done by and at the behest of Alexander himself, or perhaps his aggrieved mother. Alexander himself claimed that it was the secret plot of the far-off Persian emperor in order to justify his own counter-invasion of Asia Minor. Whatever the reason for it, the murder of Philip resulted in the ascendancy of Alexander to the head of the Corinthian League. After showcasing a penchant for brutality by violently sacking the rebelling polis of Thebes, which included selling 6,000 of the city's residents into slavery, Alexander set off on what would be the largest conquest in human history. For 12 consecutive years, the Macedonian ruler conquered, traveling more than 22,000 miles. In Turkey, he encountered the Gordian knot, a tangled mess of string that carried with it the prophecy that whoever managed to untie it would become king of Asia. The Guardian retells the legend of the fabled knot for us, writing that the story goes like this. One day, a poor peasant named Gordius arrived with his wife in a public square in an ox cart. Unbeknownst to Gordius, an oracle had informed the populace that their future king would come into town riding in a wagon. Seeing Gordius, therefore, the people made him king. In gratitude, Gordius dedicated his ox cart to Zeus, tying it up with a highly intricate knot, the Gordian knot. Another oracle, or maybe the same one, the legend is not specific, foretold that the person who untied the knot would rule Asia. Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus later described the knot as a masterwork. It comprised several knots, all so tightly entangled that it was impossible to see how they were fastened. Historian Robin Lane Fox tells us that on the day before leaving Gordium, Alexander went up to the Acropolis, meaning to try his hand at unraveling the mystery of the knot, which he had saved for his farewell. Friends gathered round to watch him, but hard though he pulled, the knot around the yoke remained stubbornly tight. When no end could be found, Alexander began to lose patience, for failure would not go down well with his men. Drawing his sword, he slashed the knot in half, producing the necessary end and correctly claiming that the knot was loosed, if not untied. In other words, he had outsmarted the problem rather than actually solving it. He soon defeated Darius III, but the Persian Empire was so large that the military victory didn't immediately allow him to claim the reins of the largely decentralized kingdom. A particularly powerful Persian governor was ruling Egypt at this moment. The Achaemenid Empire, as the first Persian empire had been known, had invaded the land of the Nile in 525 BCE. The defining engagement became known as the Battle of Pelusium, where the Persians unleashed the greatest weapon ever invented. And yes, I am fully aware of Greek fire, VX poison gas, and the atomic bomb. The weapon of mass destruction unleashed at Pelusium was, of course, the kitty cat. The Battle of Pelusium was an extremely special engagement because it was an early form of psychological warfare, as told by Herodotus, a Greek historian. The Persians had a genius tactic to use the Egyptians' religious beliefs against them. The Persians put cats in front of them as they attacked. The Egyptians didn't dare to shoot an arrow or even attack in any form because they were afraid of hurting the cats. This strategy was based on the idea that ancient Egyptians worshipped the goddess Bastet, the cat goddess of beauty, protection, the home, and fertility. During this period, Bastet was the most powerful and honored goddess in Egypt, and because of that, cats were protected and highly respected. The punishment for killing a cat was the death sentence, an absolute damnation in the afterlife. and that's why the Egyptians lost the city of Pelusium. The Egyptians lost 50,000 men, while the Persians only lost 7,000. 200 years later, Alexander announced his presence by strolling in Pelusium. But rather than facing resistance, he was met by the locals as a liberator. Unlike his Persian predecessors, Alexander embraced Egyptian culture, providing a sacrifice to the Egyptian Apis bull. Whereas the previous Persian conquerors had symbolically slain a real-life bull to declare an end to the beloved Egyptian deity. Embracing the culture, Alexander was named as pharaoh to the Egyptian people, and worked to merge his culture, known by the term Hellenic or Greek-like, with that of the people he ruled over. Additionally, he established the city of Alexandria, Egypt, and presided over mass marriages between his people and his new Egyptian subjects. This wasn't unique to Egypt, as he performed both actions everywhere he conquered. In fact, Alexander established an absurd amount of cities, all but one of which bore his name. The exception, Bucephala in modern-day Pakistan, was named after his loyal steed. It was around that location that Alexander's men finally mutinied against him, ignoring the threat that their emperor would send word back to their homelands with instructions to slaughter the soldiers' loved ones in retribution for their refusal to march ever onward. The British Museum puts his conquests into perspective, noting that during his leadership from 336 to 323 BCE, Alexander the Great conquered the Greek city-states, the Persian Empire, and founded more than 70 cities, creating an empire that stretched across 3 continents and covered about 2 million square miles. Unwilling to slaughter his own, he reluctantly turned around to return home at the age of 32, having spent 13 consecutive years carving out his empire from the husks of others. Unfortunately, he caught and succumbed to a fever on the way home, never having the chance to enjoy the spoils of his conquests. Historian Christopher Brooks provides insight into the journey home, noting that the return journey was arduous, taking years to reach the heartland of Persia. In 323 BCE, Alexander's armies finally arrived in Babylon. Exhausted and plagued by injuries from numerous battles, Alexander adhered to Macedonian and Greek tradition, obliging him to engage in excessive drinking with his generals. A combination of injuries, alcohol, and exhaustion eventually caught up with him. Supposedly, as he lay on his deathbed, his generals inquired about his successor as the Great King, and he responded, "The strongest," before passing away. The outcome was predictable. Decades of conflict as each general sought control over the vast empire Alexander had forged. 3 kingdoms emerged: the Greek mainland plus Macedonia, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Similar to the aftermath of the fragmentation of Genghis Khan's United Kingdom, the rulers of each segment of Alexander's vast empire gradually assimilated into the cultures they governed, blending into the local populace and assuming the identity of those they had conquered. In Egypt, the practice of ruler worship regained prominence as the pharaohs again became objects of worship, a circumstance that would present significant challenges for Cleopatra. Brooks elaborates. The Ptolemies governed Egypt. They wielded considerable power and, perhaps more significantly, presided over a coherent, unified state with deep-rooted traditions of kingship. Once firmly in control, the Ptolemies effectively assumed the role of pharaohs, despite retaining their Macedonian Greek ethnicity and language. While the upper echelons of governance and administration were Greek, the majority of the royal bureaucracy was comprised of Egyptians. Though there were enduring patterns of settlement and integration, the dynasty remained fiercely proud of its Greek heritage until the very end. Greek soldier colonies formed the backbone of the Ptolemaic military. Ptolemy, a close friend and trusted general of Alexander, transported the slain emperor's body to Egypt, entombing it in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, thus asserting a direct connection between his regime and Alexander himself. The Ptolemaic Dynasty would emerge as the longest-lasting of Alexander's Hellenistic monarchies, maintaining control in Egypt for 275 years. Thus, Cleopatra inherited one of the most stable kingdoms in the world. Originating in 305 BCE, the Ptolemies still governed Egypt in 69 BCE, the presumed year of Cleopatra's birth. In fact, their rule had been so steadfast that our Cleopatra is technically Cleopatra VII. Even this designation is uncertain, however. As historian Stacy Schiff notes, her name, much like her heritage, was wholly and proudly Macedonian. Cleopatra translates to glory of her fatherland in Greek. She may not have even been Cleopatra VII, as she is commonly remembered. Given the convoluted family history, it's reasonable to assume that someone, somewhere, simply lost count. Our subject of study was the third-born daughter in her family and second-born Cleopatra. Later, she would be joined by two younger brothers and another younger sister. Despite the prevailing dominance of males during this era, being a female in the Ptolemaic dynasty conferred distinct advantages. Egypt's female empowerment can be attributed in part due to the fact that Alexander's generals inherited his kingdom. The wives of military men, accustomed to handling substantial responsibilities during long deployments, were trusted to efficiently manage households. This tradition extended further back within Egyptian culture, with influential women like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti effectively ruling the kingdom for extended periods. According to Schiff, Cleopatra arguably had more powerful female role models than any other queen in history. Centuries before the arrival of the Ptolemies, Egyptian women enjoyed unique rights, such as the ability to make their own marriages, inherit equally, and hold property independently. Married women retained autonomy and could divorce while being supported afterwards. Egyptian law favored wives and children in cases where husbands acted against their interests. Roman observers noted the remarkable practices in Egypt, such as not abandoning female children to die, a contrast to Roman customs where a man was obligated to raise only his firstborn daughter. Egyptian women married later than their neighbors, engaged in financial activities, served as priests, initiated lawsuits, and owned various businesses and properties. Astonishingly, as much as 1/3 of Ptolemaic Egypt may have been under female control. Being born into the ruling dynasty of Egypt came with a significant downside: mandatory sibling marriage. Author Stephanie Dre sheds light on the origins of this tradition, attributing it to Ptolemy's daughter Arsinoe II. Married off to an elderly king as a teenager, she faced constant threats to her life, narrowly escaping dangers such as the Seleucid army marching on her kingdom. Faced with the perilous nature of her existence, Arsinoe decided that safety lay within her immediate family. She returned to Egypt and took an unconventional step by marrying her brother Ptolemy II. This practice had its roots in the revived tradition of ruler worship during this period. Living gods faced a unique challenge. Their status would be diminished in the eyes of their people if they married mere mortals. Hence, in alignment with the ancient Egyptian tradition, the newly elevated Ptolemaic gods were permitted to marry only other gods. Despite its unpleasant nature, the Ptolemies had stumbled upon a formula for political stability that would ensure the continuity of the Egyptian throne within their family's hands. Dre elaborates. After that, the tradition took hold. The Ptolemies found that incest served essential political purposes. Firstly, incestuous marriages all but guaranteed that the Macedonian ruling family would never have to mix its blood with native Egyptians, whom they appeared to disdain. Furthermore, it curtailed social mobility. Ambitious Macedonian or Egyptian boys wouldn't harbor dreams of becoming pharaoh through hard work, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. The most ambitious among them could hope, at best, to secure a position for their daughters as concubines to the king, with the chance, if the queen was barren, to become grandfather and vizier to the next king. As a result, the tradition of Ptolemaic incest minimized the threat of poisoning by outsiders. Keeping it in the family also prevented foreign powers from gaining a foothold in Egypt. Empires typically expanded through marriage alliances, and if, for instance, I were the king of the neighboring Seleucid Empire, marrying my daughter to the king of Egypt could be a strategic move. However, if Ptolemaic kings exclusively married their sisters, daughters, or nieces, this avenue of influence would be closed. Surprisingly, the 275 years of inbreeding didn't result in the typical genetic anomalies associated with royal intermarriage. While there are no surviving images of Cleopatra or her siblings, historical records only mention that the family faced challenges with weight gain and slightly protruding buggy eyes. Cleopatra's ability to captivate the two most powerful men of her era suggests not only political attractiveness, but physical appeal as well. Details regarding Cleopatra's early childhood remain largely unknown. Schiff attributes this lack of information to the limited emphasis on childhood in the ancient world, where fate and pedigree were considered the primary formative influences, and individuals tended to emerge fully formed. Her mother's absence is notable, with it being believed that she had passed away by the time Cleopatra reached the age of 12, the customary age for marriage in ancient Egypt. Cleopatra herself would not marry until the age of 18, when her younger brother, at the tender age of 10, figuratively walked down the aisle with her. As part of her upbringing, she and her older sister would have been prepared to inherit the throne while being constantly surrounded by noble-born children who were destined to be part of their royal entourage. Despite experiencing some ordinary aspects of childhood, such as playing with dolls and visiting the royal family's zoos housing giraffes, rhinos, bears, and a 45-foot python, she would also have ritually presided over religious ceremonies throughout the kingdom. Cleopatra received an elite education, facilitated by her personal tutor Philostratus, a Greek sophist from the Roman imperial period. Additionally, she had access to the finest teachers in Alexandria, the city established by Alexander, which had become the capital for this period of Egyptian history. Alexandria was renowned for its library, one of the ancient wonders of the world. The only surviving description of the structure emphasizes its grandeur, stating that the museum is a part of the palaces. It has a public walk and a place furnished with seats and a large hall in which the men of learning who belong to the museum take their common meal. This community possesses all property in common, and a priest presides over the museum. Ptolemy The library's first benefactor was reportedly so eager to collect books that he ordered the books of everyone who sailed there to be brought to him. The books were then copied into new manuscripts. He gave the new copy to the original owners and put the original copy in the library. Ancient sources suggest varying estimates of the library's collection, with one claiming over 200,000 books, while another proposes a figure as high as 700,000. Cleopatra's exceptional educational achievements were most evident in her mastery of 9 languages, including Egyptian, Greek, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Persian, Syriac, and Troglodyte, an isolated group dwelling in caves along the Red Sea. While it might be unreasonable to expect equal fluency in all 9 languages, historical evidence suggests her remarkable linguistic abilities. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch noted, "It was a pleasure merely to hear the sound of her voice, with which, like an instrument of many strings, she could pass from one language to another." In addition to languages, Cleopatra would have studied a diverse range of subjects, including geography, history, astronomy, philosophy, international diplomacy, mathematics, chemistry, medicine, zoology, and economics. Particularly skilled in science, she engaged in experiments with medicinal cures and poisons. Reportedly, she developed a remedy for male baldness, using a formula comprising burnt mice, rags, horse's teeth, beer's grease, deer mallow, reed bark, and honey. This mixture was applied as a salve to stimulate hair growth. Additionally, Cleopatra is said to have created painkillers and mind-altering drugs, although these experiments allegedly involved unwilling prisoners as her test subjects. Cleopatra's birth coincided with the ascendancy of Rome as the dominant power in the region. The Roman takeover and dissemination of Greek ideas meant that Cleopatra would dedicate numerous classroom sessions towards understanding the mindset of her political adversaries. To comprehend someone else, one must immerse oneself in their world. According to Schiff, even before she graduated to sentences, even before she learned to read, the love affair with Homer began. Early penmanship lessons included the proclamation that Homer was not a man but a god, along with the first cantos of the Iliad. Homer's work held a profound influence in Cleopatra's world, functioning as the day's equivalent of a moral, political, historical, and religious guide. With 15,693 lines, Homer's epic provided the intellectual atlas and moral compass of the time. In an age infatuated with history and glory, Homer was considered the prince of literature, and his verses were frequently cited, paraphrased, and alluded to. Children like Cleopatra, as a near contemporary expressed, were nursed in their learning by Homer and swaddled in his verses. Cleopatra absorbed a wealth of knowledge in Alexandria, a city that Schiff highlights as a hub of intellectual exploration. Alexandria witnessed groundbreaking achievements, including the first measurement of the Earth's circumference, the establishment of the sun at the center of the solar system, revelations about brain function and pulse, advancements in anatomy and physiology, and the production of definitive editions of Homer's works. Additionally, Alexandria played a crucial role in codifying geometry. Her education, however, extended beyond scholarly pursuits. Cleopatra also learned the harsh realities often associated with leadership. The Ptolemaic Dynasty, spanning nearly 300 years, was marked by internal conflicts, power struggles, and shifting alliances. Rulers ascended and were removed through a mix of political intrigue, military actions, and external influences. During Cleopatra's early years, the Roman Republic was engrossed in the process of transforming into an empire, expanding across the Mediterranean. In the first 2 decades of Cleopatra's life, the Romans dismantled significant portions of the vast Ptolemaic Empire. Cyrene, Crete, Syria, and Cyprus were already lost territories. The kingdom she would inherit had diminished, barely larger than when Ptolemy I ascended to the throne 2 centuries earlier. Egypt lost its fence of client states, finding itself surrounded by Roman lands. Cleopatra's home was spared, not out of strategic intent, but because the Romans faced uncertainties about its fate. Destroying it would incur losses. Annexation presented risks, and governance posed challenges. Cleopatra's father had to deal with the burgeoning Roman Republic from a position of extreme weakness. He had to maintain a strong front to deter an invasion. But as Schiff tells us, her father, Arlete, subscribed to the wisdom promulgated by the father of Alexander the Great. Any fortress could be stormed, provided there was a way up for a donkey with a load of gold on its back. He consequently found himself trapped in a vicious circle. The donkey loads being sent to Rome required Cleopatra's father to tax his subjects more severely, which infuriated the very people whose loyalty he labored so assiduously to buy in Rome. Rising anger among the population was nothing to sneeze at, as Schiff tells us that Cleopatra's subjects had no compunction about massing at the palace gates and loudly howling their demands. Very little was required to set off an explosion. For 2 centuries they had freely and wildly deposed, exiled, and assassinated Ptolemies. They had forced Cleopatra's great-grandmother to rule with one son when she had originally attempted to rule with the other. They had driven out Cleopatra's great-uncle. They had dragged Ptolemy XI from the palace and torn him limb from limb after he had murdered his wife. The lesson was absorbed by our title character when, as a 9-year-old, she witnessed a visiting dignitary accidentally kill a cat. Her father was unable to placate the furious crowd which demanded the man's head. Thus, Arlute found himself in a no-win situation, as Schiff notes that to please one constituency was to displease another. Failure to comply with Rome would lead to intervention. Failure to stand up to Rome would lead to riots. In 57 BCE, her father traveled to Rome to appeal to the Roman Senate for the release of his brother, the deposed ruler of Cyprus. During his absence, the Alexandrians overthrew him in favor of Cleopatra's eldest sister, Berenice IV. Despite Egypt's relatively advanced stance on feminism, the question of Berenice's husband soon arose. For unknown reasons, she had bypassed her younger brothers and called upon a Seleucid prince to serve beside her. However, their engagement abruptly ended a few days later when she had him strangled. She then married a Pontic priest, known for his anti-Roman sentiments. The new rulers of Egypt justified their coup by sending over 100 dignitaries to Rome to explain the alleged unjust brutality of Arlute's reign. However, Cleopatra's father intercepted each messenger, poisoning some, assassinating others, and forcing the rest out of Rome before they could deliver their news. His politicking earned him key allies, and in 55 BCE, Cleopatra's father returned to Alexandria at the head of foreign Roman legions. Among them was a young, wide-eyed officer named Mark Antony. With the backing of the Roman legions, he executed his rebellious daughter and thinned the ranks of the unruly Alexandrian court. Cleopatra, now 13 years old, became first in line for succession to the throne. Schiff writes that Her political education could be said to have been completed in 56. She would draw heavily on this chapter a decade later. To be pharaoh was good. To be a friend and ally of Rome was better. The question was not how to resist that power, but how best to manipulate it. 5 years after the return, Cleopatra's father died of natural causes. He was in his mid-60s and had had ample time to prepare his succession, departing from tradition to leave the throne to 2 siblings, which would seem to indicate either that Cleopatra manifested exceptional promise at an early age, or that her father felt he was heading off a power struggle by appointing the 2 jointly. Or perhaps that he believed Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as inseparable, which was hardly the case. And at the age of 18, she stepped briskly and vigorously into the role of queen. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on the platform formerly known as Twitter. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.